Hello everyone and welcome back to season 2 of the PGN Podcast. This podcast has one simple message: to normalise the conversation on resilience, our environment and our future in a climate changed world, with our communities at the heart of it all. Our primary goal is to foster discussions about flooding, climate resilience and related environmental issues to better support communities. We're here to take a deeper dive into the conversations we began in season 1. We'll be connecting hearts and minds, ambition, passion alongside our community and experts. Together we'll work towards building a more resilient future in our ever-changing world. I am Meshi Taka, the project lead for Project Groundwater Northumbria, which is what PGN stands for, and your host for this season. Let's jump right in. In season 1, we explored the importance of researching and investing in a better understanding of groundwater flood risk. In this episode, we will deal into how developing comprehensive and intelligent systems focused on the subsurface can enhance our response to the changing climate and create new solution opportunities. Today, we have a whole new round of guests. We have Tim Kearsley from BGS. We'll find out more about BGS in a second. We have Holger Kessler from Atkins Realis, and we have a familiar face, Rhiannon and Marchi-Smith from Project Groundwater Northumbria. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Hello.
Tim, tell us more about yourself and BGS.
I'm Tim Kearsley. I'm currently head of research and modelling at BGS. I sit within the national team. BGS is a government agency. BGS stands for British Geological Survey. We're an old organisation. We've been around nearly 190 years. And originally we were set up to find resources. So here in Newcastle, it would have been where was the coal, where's the limestone, where's the ironstone. But we use that understanding to build geological maps of the subsurface and increasingly these days 3D geological models. And we're now using those for a much wider range of applications, from geothermal to carbon capture and storage, offshore wind, engineering, and there's an element of our maps that it actually goes into your insurance premiums if you have a house. So one of the things that feeds into that calculation of risk is our geological maps. But probably most relevant for this conversation and this group of this audience is we can use that information to help understand how groundwaters move through the subsurface.
Thank you, Tim. BGS are one of our partner consultants on this project, so we'll delve into that a bit more in a minute. Hi, Holger. Welcome to PGN Podcast.
Thank you.
Tell me a bit more about you.
Yes, my name is Holger Kessler. I am stakeholder manager at Atkins Realis. Atkins Realis is a global engineering services organization working in infrastructure, energy, nuclear, and basically, I have history with the British Geological Survey. I was with Tim for my first sort of 25 years of my career working as a geologist. I then had a period in government working at the Geospatial Commission in the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, and also after that a year in the Government Office for Science. And all I do concerns the subsurface and making data and information better available and accessible. So yeah, looking forward to this.
Thank you, Holger. And last, but definitely not the least, I used to go my right-hand woman, Rhiannon, welcome back. You want to reintroduce yourself to our audience?
So I'm Rhiannon Marchi-Smith. I was obviously here last year. So from Project Groundwater Northumbria, and I'm the lead hydrogeologist and technical coordinator working on behalf of Gateshead Council, so get the pleasure of working very closely with BGS and our various partners.
In your introduction there, Tim, the word subsurface came up a few times. Holger's mentioned it and you've mentioned it as well. Can you just explain to our listeners and viewers what subsurface is when we in this kind of conversation?
Well, basically we're referring to everything under the ground. And many people don't really think about what's down there. I think it's just it's all the same, but actually it's the subsurface and the both the natural and the anthropogenic. So anthropogenic would be mine workings. So obviously particularly here under Newcastle, there's an awful lot of mine workings and archaeology. So obviously there's bits of the subsurface that are probably relevant that can cause hazard, but they also produce opportunities. But also the natural subsurface, so the geology is variable, and a lot of that is often part of the reasons why the city is here today. Newcastle as a city is because of its geology, because of the coal, because of the iron. And so these all have an effect on how water and other things move through the subsurface.
Just taking it over to Holger then, because your role when you were kind of in the advisory position to government, it was around exploring the opportunities with the subsurface, was it not?
Yeah, so I was just going to add one small part to Tim's answer, because subsurface can also be subsea. So really, it's sort of the line between the atmosphere and the air and something underneath. So, but what Tim and I particularly are talking about, our subsurface, is the sort of solid earth, the geological subsurface. And yeah, thanks for mentioning the project. Should be, by the time this goes on air, should be have published by the time we broadcast this. Was called The Future of the Subsurface. It's part of a Government Office for Science Foresight program, and we really sort of dived in to the various parts of the subsurface. The subsurface made up of, as Tim mentioned, lots of components. It's a big system of systems, man-made, engineered structures and infrastructure, but also the natural components. And then, as Tim said, alluded to, fluids and gases and energy that moves in between the soils, the rocks, the man-made infrastructure. And of course, we also have cultural heritage in the subsurface. So we have archaeology, and how all these parts fit together and interact was part of our Foresight program.
That's how we came to meet you. Well, twice we've met you now, the Innovation Festival, but also when we joined your roundtable here in Newcastle. Rhiannon and I attended that session, and I think Rhiannon would like to take us through why PGN was part of that conversation.
Yes, we obviously met at the Innovation Festival in 2023, and I think that sort of sets the key kind of baseline for how PGN is helping to build this integrated mapping and inform forecasting. So this comes into how we can work closely with Holger and with BGS to improve our overall understanding. So I guess the key thing about PGN is we have a series of outputs, don't we? Mm-hmm. And the Innovation Festival in 2023, the result of that was looking at a single point of contact. So that's away from groundwater and geology specifically, but closer to these bigger strategic questions around collaboration, which is where, and Holger will be able to say a bit more about the subsurface and the National Underground Asset Register, NUAR. Yeah. This is where they align, and there's a lot of synergy between the two. Our outcomes through PGN, and I guess I can break it down into our work streams, where we've got working with BGS on our work stream 1, which is improving our mapping and developing a 3D geological model. Then we want to get new data, drill new boreholes, developing the data management, and a single point of contact where we have that stakeholder collaboration. Then we've got the modelling, which is obviously taking in all that new data to get predictive forecasting. So I think the key part of that is how that all comes together, which will be when we come to our design and implementation and we want to develop a concept. And this is where we're getting into this big picture, blue sky thinking.
Future-proofing approach kind of thing.
Exactly. And that's how PGN, I guess, ultimately wants to help. So it's how we can locally produce a lot and create resilience within the Northeast, but what are those opportunities in the bigger picture? And that's where we can all come together to work strategically and improve that collaboration.
Yeah,
So
a proper joint up approach. I mean, it leads us nicely into, I think, BGS. One of the interesting bits of work you've done before was in Glasgow. And you coming into PGN has given us access to some of the processes and how that came to be. And we're learning from that as well, also looking to the future.
So Glasgow, we had several large, big projects working in Glasgow, a city that is geologically very similar and industrially very similar to Newcastle. So we're building a lot of the learning from that. And again, there it was trying to understand the best way to explain what is quite a complicated subsurface in a way that a wider audience can use. The other thing that we've developed on the back of the work that we did in Glasgow was an Earth observatory. So one of the big things that is we're foreseeing as a big area of interest is mine water heat. So we BGS now has what's called the UK Earth Observatories, which is really focused around de-risking heat in the subsurface. So we have an observatory in Glasgow, which is focusing on mine waters and trying to understand how, if you start moving mine waters around and putting heat in and out of the system, how do they respond? This research will help answer questions like, how close do you want schemes to be? What the connectivities? We also have another site in Cheshire, which is working on a little bit of different geology, but for answering again similar questions. How can and we do strongly believe geothermal is one of the key things that the UK, an opportunity the UK has in renewables, and if we really want to hit our carbon neutral targets, this is something that we can do under pretty much most cities in the UK. But there are these very specific geological questions that we're trying to help answer, again, to then inform city councils as to how best to exploit these opportunities.
That's brilliant, because it's linking up what could be considered as a risk, the flood risk, to what is essentially an opportunity. It's linking up sectors that typically work independent of each other and showing the value in actually that linked up approach, where one problem becomes becomes a solution in another avenue. Holger, this was a quote that I think I got from you. Well and consciously governed on-the-ground resources may significantly increase the resilience of economy and society. It's a quote by Hamora Vido, 2021, and it's one that you referenced.
Yeah, thanks for that quote. Still, as I've seen the last edition of the Foresight report, still features. And just one step back from that, and sort of right back to Tim's opening statements. The British Geological Survey has been mapping the UK underground for 190 years, and that really is part of being able to govern, or you might manage, and it maybe even regulate activities in the subsurface. First of all, you need to know what's there. And that sounds very, very profound. But if we think of having Ordnance Survey maps or local plans or Google Maps, we can do better if we know where what is and how it links together. And this is sadly not quite yet achieved in the subsurface, both because it's complex, it's dark, it's inaccessible. We need to drill more boreholes, but also we have a lot of information which isn't accessible and usable by the right people at the right time. And I know you've run into that quite a bit between the project partners, and I think that's it's very administrative and very bureaucratic, but it is part of what PGN is addressing and showcasing, that we have a lot of information which sits in different parts and silos. Maybe there is technical interoperability, but also often it is the records and the information is just simply inaccessible. And so therefore, one of the obvious outcomes from the Foresight project and from the National Underground Asset Register and from the work Tim and the BGS are doing is we need to speed up the gathering of information. We still need primary survey and mapping and borehole drilling, but we also have a lot in the bank that we need to make accessible to people who need it.
NUAR, so Rhiannon's mentioned it, if you've mentioned it again. For those who are not familiar with NUAR, can you just give us a bit of an insight of what it is?
Yeah, very simple. It is a digital map of all buried infrastructure of the United Kingdom. We already have a version of NUA in Scotland, Scottish Vault. Always important to remember that. So NUA is for England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and it basically has put every water, gas, electricity company and local authority data that represents the buried infrastructure, pipes and cables, into one common data model onto one common platform to help people who own and operate and maintain and repair the infrastructure, seeing what's around them and what's there.
So the idea
So
is
a digital map of all pipes and cables is sort of simple.
And just for context, before NUA became a thing, traditionally speaking, and as somebody who was a consultant back in the day, at the start of each project, you would write to 7 different utilities and ask them for their paper records. And typically those would be somewhat out of date. It could be quite frustrating when you had a contractor inside and the first thing they'll do is hit a service and say, well, that's not mapped. So the idea is NUA is more dynamic. It's centrally accessible. And when it's updated, it's done so at a central point. Yep,
it's very, very well said. Thanks for joining the project team. You've nailed that. Going back to the BGS, Tim and I, when we first joined, people would have to call in and order some borehole records, which were then sent via fax or in an envelope. And now we have a digital geo index with all the borehole data for the country accessible. So it's a similar thing. The difficulty with NUA, which also PGN has run into, is that the buried infrastructure in the UK is owned by 690 or 700 thereabouts asset owners. So not only 6 or 7, in some areas of central London, you would have to go to, or in Newcastle, you have to go to 15 organisations, 5 telco operators, a water company, gas company, local authorities, and so on.
Holger's mentioned the borehole things, and one of the things, again, this is one of the advantages of digitalisation, is we now, as Holger said, any borehole that has been drilled and been lodged with the BGS, you can now access through our website. And this is phenomenal, not just for understanding the subsurface, but also if you're a ground contractor or even a planner, it limits the amount of ground investigation you can do. GI, ground investigation, is one of the biggest costs of projects. And before we had this, often we found that people were drilling pretty much the same bit of ground multiple times. Because they couldn't access the record, because, as Holger said, you have to fax them. So again, this is kind of one of the opportunities we now have with digital things, and particularly web-based things. I know it's been a few years since the web was a big thing, but it's still a real game changer, particularly in the lifetime of an organisation like BGS. But being able to have all of that information freely available at the point of need for minimal cost, or the boreholes for us we don't charge, is, I think, a really powerful thing for helping improve and improving efficiencies at the end of the day.
I agree. The next step, though, is, and we've discussed this separately, is the gap in the incoming information. So you rely on the people undertaking this work to deposit that information with BGS. And it goes back to Holger's point, the governance of it. So it should be happening, but it really isn't. And is there a conversation around governance or inclusion of BGS in certain regulation that enables that or facilitates that?
So we have recently, through the Geospatial Commission, inserted a paragraph in the government building playbook, which is the boilerplate contract that governs most government contracts, to say that borehole data should be lodged with BGS. And so most government projects, if they are lodged and are scoped using that playbook, should therefore lodge their data. The other thing that we've actually found is quite powerful is just the volume. The moment people see that there is a resource there that they use, and we're increasingly, the borehole part of our website is the most used part of the BGS website these days. And there is a sort of, we are starting to see that sort of cultural thing, engineering companies starting to realize that this is a resource that will outlast even them as a country. We are, at the moment, really working on that virtuous circle view, and it is quite powerful because it's providing back to stakeholders what they want. But yeah, I mean, there is a question about legislation, and other countries do this. They do actually formally do that legislation.
And I'm going to pull Rhiannon into this because we've had some good conversation about this, haven't we? I will use the setting of the planning and the fact that under that process, there are consultees, identified consultees, and the BGS is not specifically, use the word specifically, identified as one. But as somebody who used to convince clients to do ground investigation, whether it's for testing the suitability of SUDs, which is a big thing in that space, but also just understanding the ground in which you're working or proposing the work. There is extensive information. If you go on any planning portal, there's a whole bunch of ground investigation data there that sits there completely separate to the space you work. And I get what you're saying about certain large consultants, but look at the projected growth for a place like Gateshead. Look at the number of new homes. Think about the amount of new data that will come in, but not direct to yourself because of that work. So Rhiannon, what are kind of things that the role that PGN can play to hopefully support some of the arguments that BGS and Holger are making here?
So yeah, like you say, we've had many a conversation about how disparate this information is, and also around consultees, and it's much like Holger said also about NUAR. How can we bring everyone together? That's what it comes down to. And one of the key things, like obviously with PGN, we're focused around the Flood and Water Management Act and risk management authorities, so RMAs, which have focused a lot more in Series 1. But what we can discuss is where are the gaps in that? And I think that's the future when we look to PGN and what we can do. So that's where you say about consultees. Like we have partners, BGS, the Coal Authority, the Environment Agency. The Environment Agency is an RMA, who's the local lead local flood authority, also an RMA. BGS and the Coal Authority isn't. And the challenge there, like you said, regarding SUDs or any kind of design and interaction with the subsurface, not a consultee and not involved in those conversations. And I think the aim of PGN, and when we develop our concept, it's how can we bring that in? And hopefully through like developing data management and a single point of contact and improving those stakeholder relationships to where we can start to look forward and start to challenge those gaps to say there are organisations there such as BGS and such as the Coal Authority, who Coal Authority have assets in the subsurface but not included in those conversations, and those directly interact with designs that may be done by consultants and contractors. How can we bring everyone together so everyone has a say in what actually goes forward? And I think it's an important point that you make about the planning portal as well. This is disparate information again. We had a conversation about it not so long ago where there was a bit of information missing, and you can point out that information's on the planning portal, but that's owned by the council, so that sits there. You've got geoindex and the boreholes, that sits somewhere else. And when you've got, say, consultants working, it's not their fault, but the fact that information sits so separately, you're relying on an individual to know where all the information is, and that isn't always the case.
And this is what we talk about the next step for NUAR. So NUAR is showing that, over 600 asset owners, and somehow you're creating a central database. And looking at the subsurface, what else can we do? How can we push it to the next level? And I guess that's where it comes from. We have to look at the bigger things, the kind of infrastructure that sets these pathways. So that's what we're talking about, policy and regulation, but also centralized information, BGS being the cog in the wheel, those passageways to deposit no longer optional, but mandatory. Not putting words in your mouth, Tim, but you see where I'm going with this.
Yeah. I think the other thing that we can sort of talk about, which is again an opportunity, which is, we forget, we're still halfway through the digital transition. We now, there are now ways of having things hosted by one site that you can host on another site. So WMSs, and this is more technical side of things, but you could have now a single point of that someone could go to, which is actually drawing data from half a dozen different agencies. So you're not having to have a single agency centralize it. These are now options that we can move towards. And I think, so it almost makes it easier. You can bring it's physically possible to have data held by multiple agencies that you can then access through a single point. But it's just them making that happen.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're looking at with our data management work stream, that single point of contact and single point of data, is the idea that that central point is where all the updates come from, is where everything ultimately ends up. It still feeds the existing systems. It doesn't override them. It creates a space for organizations that don't have the intelligence or their own systems. But it ensures that you don't have various databases with different levels of accuracy. All data is calibrated to the same timeline if it goes through the same central point. And that's one of the things that we find, hopefully we're part of this project. We're not making claims we're going to transform, but we will try and make some headway in living something that can have a legacy beyond the lifetime of this project. But talking about the future, BGS, on the back of the work we've done together, you now have a new project, don't you?
Yeah, so what we've done for Newcastle, as part of PGN, has been very much focused. So we've been trying to, we've done regional cross sections to try and help you guys conceptualize the complexity of the geology. We've now recently delivered maps of the complicated glacial deposits we have in Newcastle. So Newcastle has quite the average thickness of unconsolidated deposits in the UK is about 8 meters, but you have over 80 meters in some places.
Yes, just to add to that, we have 3 areas: Newcastle, Gateshead, and Berwick, obviously.
Yeah. We also have, I would say, a complicated bedrock, which we know has been mined as well, and has also quite significant faults, which also provide pathways. So we've obviously developed 3D models for specifically for Newcastle, for the Project Groundwater Northumbria project. But as a result of this, and building on the theme of these urban projects that BGS has been doing for probably the last 30 years, we've now centrally taken some of our funding that our direct funding from government to try and build a project on Newcastle Gateshead, allowing us to build on the innovation that's come from Project Groundwater Northumbria, and firstly to build it out as well. So we're not just dealing with Gateshead.
Yes,
we can do it for the whole council area, but also as a testbed for how we do urban coalfields more widely. And we really wanted to use this as a testbed for how we deal with other cities that sit on coalfields. So 25% of the cities in the UK sit over coalfields. And they often have some of the complicated problems that Newcastle has and Gateshead has. So we really wanted to use this as a flagship so that we can build our own portfolio of work in the urban areas.
Yeah, but it's kind of building on what you said earlier about the potential for renewables. It's something that Gateshead Council has a lot of experience in. Rhiannon, would like to talk us through the link between the research we're doing and actually supporting geothermal energy.
So the key really is conceptual understanding and actually knowing what's happening in the subsurface. So that understanding that we're gaining, and obviously that conceptual understanding that we'll gain through the 3D mapping that you're doing, Tim, that is invaluable when it comes to geothermal, because it doesn't exist without knowing how that water's flowing through the subsurface. So that foundational understanding and knowledge sets the scene for any geothermal that happens on top of that. So Gateshead's quite fortunate as a council that they do have the Gateshead Energy Centre, and they are running geothermal schemes. That's where we have that natural link between it and an opportunity that's really open there to drive that forward to the renewable, sustainable options that come from the intelligence that we're creating.
Just going back to Holger, Hi, Holger.
Yeah.
Given your experience,
Good conversation.
given your experience, and we're looking to the future here, given your considerable experience kind of in the office of government, but also your current role at Atkins Realis and the work you're doing on NUA, what does the future look like? What could we aspire to, especially when we're looking at a changing climate and therefore a changing environment? How is a bigger part of the kind of environmental conversation that we're having right now?
Yeah, I was reflecting, and of course, the interesting thing is I can do some future. I can do a future prediction, and then see if, when this broadcasts, my predictions have actually become reality. So, I was in the Government Office for Science in the Futures and Foresight team, and I think it's important sometimes to spend some time on taking off the constraints that we have in terms of resources and abilities and technology, and think, what could be in 5 or 10 years' time. And I think it's clear to me that we will have to take a more coordinated approach to subsurface planning, and that doesn't mean, Tim, by the way, it's the BGS or it's a particular organization. It could be a local authority. It has to take the approach to and Tim mentioned international. We have analogies. We have precedents in Finland, in the Netherlands, in Singapore, in various places where the subsurface is effectively treated as we treat the above ground. We set certain areas aside for certain functions. That might be groundwater, that might be heat and cool. Remember, it's not just the heat. We can also use the subsurface to store cool in times of excess heat and cool, and then use it as a battery. And all of that will need coordination and management. So I can foresee that happening certainly in densely populated city areas. That then follows on. I think I can predict that we will have to tackle the regulation of heat and cool. We can't all just have a Wild West. You can stick your heat exchanger wherever you want. And for that, we need to understand the system and the system of systems, which is why this PGN project is key to understand how the water and the heat and the rocks interact. You've got pollutants in there, you've got heat and cool in there, and you need to know how that system works. So we will, and a little bit of Atkins Realis here, our strapline is engineering a better planet for the future of its people. We need to engineer, and for that, an engineer needs to know the ingredients and the size of the battery effectively. And then the final one, I think I can foresee technological. It's all in the Foresight report, which will be out hopefully. There are technological advances, robotics, miniaturization of drones, both in the air, which can go into voids such as coal mines. If they're not flooded, then we'll have to invent some swimming drones, and crawlers are going into ever smaller pipes. So there's a project called PipeBots at Sheffield and Birmingham universities, and I think we will get increasingly better data about the subsurface. There's also better sensors that Tim will know all about, constantly being developed in the geophysical world. So I think we will be able to shine more light into the subsurface, just as we can through our bodies, and we'll be able to scan the earth and have much better data in 10, 15 years' time, to enable everything we talked about.
That's brilliant. And coming back to Rhiannon, because we do have one final work stream at PGN, and it's a design and implementation. The reason we don't talk about that as often is because it's the final chapter where we bring all the different parts together and we look at the bigger picture. And one of the conversations we've had a lot about on this podcast, but also in our workplaces, is the role nature-based solution plays. We recognize we can no longer do the whole push nature to the side. We have to work with nature.
Absolutely.
Our solutions need to consider nature a lot more. And above ground, that is very mature. It's the buzzword in most places when you talk about resilience and climate change. And I think we still need to build on the role subsurface plays in that, because subsurface has capacity, storage, informal storage. We know that it's there. And also we can transfer, or we can convert what could be a risk into an opportunity. And that's what we're looking at for the design and implementation workstream, isn't it, Rhiannon?
Absolutely. So yeah, it links to everything we've said. It links to collaboration, all the stakeholders working together, and as Holger's mentioned, planning, planning always comes down to it, and the fact that for a long time the subsurface has been the Wild West of the planning system. So there are questions around how, with our understanding, we could hopefully look at that, but how you can use that as storage. Like, we can look at the geothermal options, but are there options to use the workings as temporary storage if we can get a reasonable understanding of it? Like, even permanent storage, just if it's forecasted and we know that there's going to be heavy rain and inflows into the sewer network affecting built infrastructure, what are the options there? I guess these are quite commonplace, that the built infrastructure, obviously at surface or even roads, internationally are often incorporated, whether that's creating storage under roads or things like that, whereas we have this man-made, huge
untapped potential, yes,
man-made aquifer that's there. And the first step is obviously the management and how we can come up with solutions and think about improving the mine water management. But the benefits from that, whether it's kind of geothermal, whether it's improved storage and just increasing sustainability across the region and potentially other regions with very similar geology and industrial past, I think there's ample opportunity there. But I think that's where, and I'm going to plug PGN, well, I should have PGN Podcast, but I think that's where it's important so we've got two events this year, working very closely with ICE and also with IAH. People are probably less familiar, so the International Association of Hydrogeologists, and we're sponsoring 2 events this year. But historically, the Geological Society and ICE and also SciWem, ICE and SciWem a bit more so, but the Geological Society does not work so closely with professional organisations. And I think bringing those parties together, especially kind of from that perspective, and that brings in sort of the international perspective from there as well, is where there'd be kind of a lot of opportunity for the next steps.
Yes, creating professional mixers, isn't it? It's that good conversation that the Institution of Civil Engineers are having around people and nature positivity, the same conversation that SciWem is having. IAH is having as well, so that's the International Association of Hydrogeologists. They're having the same conversations, and actually, if we link up those spaces, we can share knowledge, we can transfer knowledge, but we can also collaborate on joint goals. Surely that's a good thing, and I think with the special funding we've had with this project, it's given us the opportunity. Perhaps we wouldn't have been able to do it so easily in our normal day jobs, but we have the opportunity here to kind of step into those rooms and link up some of our partners as well. So I'm going to look for final words. I want an inspiration closing statement from Tim. Put him on the spot.
Thank you. Well,
what do you want to leave us with?
Well, I'll leave you with, firstly, there's an awful lot of more data out there publicly available right now about for the subsurface. And again, one of the biggest challenges we have at BGS is nobody knows what geology is. It's not taught in schools. That's a whole other conversation. But there is free data out there. If you're interested in the subsurface, go and have a look at our website. But I think one of the key threads that I'm and I completely concur with that's come from this conversation is we do need greater linking up. There is huge opportunities here. There are risks as well, but by linking up, sharing data, we will hopefully make a better future.
Holger, what would you like to leave us with today?
Yes, well, thanks. It's been a fantastic conversation. I really sad not to be there, but I look forward to the events. We'll hopefully cross paths this year. I think the future of the subsurface is looking bright. I think for all the reasons that we've mentioned. People coming together, sharing a common understanding that we do need to work with nature, and the subsurface is a large part of that. I think what I would like to leave us with is that it's time for action. The pressures that we have from the environment and the climate change impacts are increasing year on year, and we haven't got the luxury that we had 190 years ago to be able to work independently on little bits of geology and coal and little bits of infrastructure. We do need to speed up and do what we talk about. And I'm on a positive. I mean, Gateshead, Newcastle, your area has been the driving force behind NUAR. Asset owners, local authorities, Environment Agency, Coal Authority, BGS are all working together, and I think we just need to continue and speed up doing it as opposed to just theorizing.
Thank you, Holger. Rhiannon?
I'm going to keep it simple, but say pretty much the same thing. So we all know, for the most part, the intelligence is there, but I think in reality, we can probably transform the world just with improved collaboration and sharing that data between each other.
That's a closing
Agreed.
Statement. Thank you all for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. And to our listeners and viewers, thank you for joining us. For additional information on the topics discussed, please check the episode notes for useful links. But for now, thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Project Groundwater Northumbria is a research and innovation project funded by DEFRA as part of the £200 million Flood and Coastal Innovation Programmes, which is managed by the Environment Agency. The programmes will drive innovation in flood and coastal resilience and adaptation to a changing climate. This project is led by Gateshead Council with regional and national partners. With this funding, we are working on practical, innovative actions and knowledge sharing with our communities at the heart. For more information about PGN, please visit www.pgn.org.uk.